Hi guys! So today I'm moving on to chapters 22 and 23 of Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Alright, chapter 22. Nicole awoke late, murmuring something back into her dream before she parted her long lashes tangled with sleep. Dick's bed was empty. Only after a minute did she realize that she had been awakened by a knock at their salon door. "Entrance," she called, but there was no answer. And after a moment, she slipped on a dressing gown and went to open it. A Sergeant DeVille confronted her courteously and stepped inside the door. "Mr. Afghan North, he is here?" "What? No, he's gone to America." "When did he leave, madam?" "Yesterday morning." He shook his head and waved his forefinger at her in a quicker rhythm. "He was in Paris last night. He is registered here, but his room is not occupied. They told me I had better ask this room." "Sounds very peculiar to me. We saw him off yesterday morning on the boat train." "Be that as it may, he has been seen here this morning. Even his carte d'identité has been seen. And there you are." "We know nothing about it," she proclaimed in amazement. He considered. He was an ill-smelling, handsome man. "You were not with him at all last night?" "But no. We have arrested someone. We are convinced we have at last arrested the correct person." "I assure you that I haven't any idea what you're talking about. If it's the Mr. Abrams North, the one we know well, if he was in Paris last night, we weren't aware of it." The man nodded, sucked his upper lip, convinced but disappointed. "What happened?" Nicole demanded. He showed his palms, puffing out his closed mouth. He had begun to find her attractive, and his eyes flickered at her. "What do you wish, madam? A summer affair? Mr. Afghan North was robbed, and he made a complaint. We have arrested the miscreant. Mr. Afghan should come to identify him and make the proper charges." Nicole pulled her dressing gown closer around her and dismissed him briskly. Mystified, she took a bath and dressed. By this time, it was after 10, and she called Rosemary but got no answer. Then she phoned the hotel office and found that Abe had indeed registered at 6:30 this morning. His room, however, was still unoccupied. Hoping for a word from Dick, she waited in the parlor of the suite. Just as she had given up and decided to go out, the office called and announced, "Monsieur Corchel." "On what business?" she demanded. "He says he knows you and the doctrine. He said there is a Mr. Freeman into prison that is a friend of all the world. He says there is an injustice and he wishes to see Monsieur North before he himself is arrested." "We know nothing about it," Nicole disclaimed, the whole business with a vehement clap of the receiver. Abe's bizarre reappearance made it plain to her how fatigued she was with his dissipation. Dismissing him from her mind, she went out, ran into Rosemary at the dressmaker's, and stopped with her for artificial flowers and all-colored strings of colored beads on the Rue de Rivoli. She helped Rosemary choose a diamond for her mother and some scarves and novel cigarette cases to take home to business associates in California. For her son, she bought Greek and Roman soldiers, a whole army of them, costing over 1,000 francs. Once again, they spent their money in different ways, and again Rosemary admired Nicole's method of spending. Nicole was sure that the money she spent was hers. Rosemary still thought her money was miraculously lent to her, and she must consequently be very careful with it. It was fun spending money in the sunlight of the foreign city with healthy bodies under them that sent streams of color up to their faces, with arms and hands, legs and ankles that they stretched out confidently, reaching or stepping with the confidence of women, lovely to men. When they got back to the hotel and found Dick, all bright and new in the morning, both of them had a moment of complete childish joy. He had just received a garbled telephone call from Abe, who, so it appeared, had spent the forenoon in hiding. It was one of the most extraordinary telephone conversations I've ever had. Dick had talked not only to Abe, but to a dozen others. On the phone, these supernumeraries had been typically introduced as, "Man wants to talk to you in the Toupee Dome. Well, he says he was in it. What is it? Hey, somebody, shut up. Anyhow, he was in some scandal, and he could possibly go home. My own personal is he's had a gulp sounded, and thereafter what the party had rested with the unknown. The phone yielded up a supplementary offer. I thought it would appeal to you anyhow as a psychologist. The vague personality who corresponded to this statement was eventually hung up on the phone. In a sequence, he failed to appeal to Dick as a psychologist or indeed as anything else. Abe's conversation flowed on as followed. Hello? Well, hello. Who are you? Well, there was interpolated snorts of laughter. Well, I'll put somebody else on the line. Sometimes Dick could hear Abe's voice, accompanied by scufflings, droppings of the receiver, faraway fragments such as, No, I don't, Mr. North. Then a pert, decided voice had said, If you are a friend of Mr. North, will you come down and take him away? Abe cut in, solemn and ponderous, beating it all down with an overtone of earthbound determination. Dick, I've launched a riot in Montmartre. I'm going over to get Freeman out of jail. Once again, the receiver was a chorus of innumerable melodies. Why are you back in Paris? Dick demanded. I got as far as Everett, and I decided to take a plane back so I could compare it with St. Sulpice. I don't intend to bring St. Sulpice back to Paris. I don't even mean Barracu. I mean Saint Germain. For God's sake, wait a minute, and I'll put the chasseur on the wire. For God's sake, don't. Listen, did Mary get off all right? Yes. Dick, I want you to talk with a man I met here this morning, the son of a naval officer who's been to every doctor in Europe. Let me tell you about him. Dick had run off at this point. Perhaps that was a piece of ingratitude, for he needed grist for the grinding activity of his mind. Abe used to be so nice, Nicole told Rosemary. So nice, long ago, when Dick and I were first married. If you had known him then, he'd come to stay with us for weeks and weeks, and we scarcely knew he was in the house. Sometimes he'd play, sometimes he'd be in the library with a muted piano, making love to it by the hour. Dick, do you remember that maid? She thought he was a ghost, and sometimes Abe used to meet her in the hall and moo at her, and it cost us a whole tea service once. But we didn't care. So much fun, so long ago. Rosemary envied them for their fun, imagining a life of leisure unlike her own. She knew little of leisure, but she had the respect for those who have never had it. She thought of it as arresting, without realizing that the Divers were as far from relaxing as she was herself. What did this to him? She asked. Why does he have to drink? Nicole shook her head right and left, disclaiming responsibility for the matter. So many smart men go to pieces nowadays. And when haven't they? Dick asked. Smart men play close to the line because they have to. Some of them can't stand it, so they quit. It must lie deeper than that. Nicole clung to her conversation. She was also irritated that Dick should contradict her before Rosemary. Artists like Fernand don't seem to have to wallow in alcohol. Why is it just Americans who dissipate? There were so many answers to this question that Dick decided to leave it in the air, to buzz victoriously in Nicole's ear. He had become intensely critical of her. Though he thought she was the most attractive human creature he had ever seen, though he got from her everything he needed, he scented battle from afar, and subconsciously he had been hardening and arming himself, hour by hour. He was not given to self-indulgence, and he felt comparatively graceless at this moment of indulging in himself, blinding his eyes with the hope that Nicole guessed as only an emotional excitement about Rosemary. He was not sure. Last night at the theater she had referred pointlessly to Rosemary as a child. The trio lunched downstairs in an atmosphere of carpets and padded waiters, who did not march at the stomping quick step of those men who brought good food to the tables whereon they had recently dined. Here there were families of Americans staring around at families of Americans, trying to make conversation with one another. There was a party at the next table that they could not account for. It consisted of an expensive, somewhat secretarial, would-you-mind-repeating young man and a score of women. The women were neither young nor old, nor of any particular social class, yet the party gave the impression of a unit, held more closely together, for example, than a group of wives stalling through a professional congress of their husbands. Certainly it was more of a unit than any conceivable tourist party. An instinct made Dick suck back the grave derision that formed on his tongue. He asked the waiter to find out who they were. "Those are the Gold Star Muzzers," explained the waiter. Aloud and in low voices they exclaimed. Rosemary's eyes filled with tears. "Probably the young ones are the wives," said Nicole. Over his wine, Dick looked at them again. In their happy faces, the dignity that surrounded and pervaded the party, he perceived all the maturity of an older America. For a while, the sober woman who had come to mourn for their dread, for something they could not repair, made the room beautiful. Momentarily, he sat again on the father's knee, riding with Mosby while the old loyalties and devotions fought on around him. Almost with an effort, he turned back to his two women at the table and faced the whole new world in which he believed. "Do you mind if I pull down the curtain?" All right, that's the end of chapter 22. I'm gonna take a sip break. It's just black coffee. All right, chapter 23. Abe North was still in the Ritz bar, where he had been since 9 in the morning. When he arrived seeking sanctuary, the windows were open and great beams were busy at pulling up the dust from smoky carpets and cushions. Chasseurs tore through the corridors, liberated and disembodied, moving for the moment in pure space. The sit-down bar for women, across from the bar proper, seemed very small. It was hard to imagine what throngs it could accommodate in the afternoon. The famous Paul, the concierge, had not yet arrived, but Claude, who was checking stock, broke off his work with no improper surprise to make Abe a pick-me-up. Abe sat on a bench against the wall. After 2 drinks, he began to feel better. So much better that he mounted to the barber shop and was shaved. When he returned to the bar, Paul had arrived in his custom-built motor, from which he had disembarked correctly at the Boulevard des Capuchins. Paul liked Abe and came over to talk. "I was supposed to ship home this morning," Abe said. "I mean yesterday morning, or whatever this is." "Why didn't you?" asked Paul. Abe considered and happened finally to reason. "I was reading a serial in Liberty, and the next installment was due here in Paris. So if I'd sailed, I'd have missed it. Then I never would have read it." "It must be a very good story." "It's a terrible story." Paul arose, chuckling, and paused, leaning on the back of a chair. "If you really want to get off, Mr. North, there are friends of yours going tomorrow on the France. Mr. what is his name, and Slim Pearson. Mr. I'll think of it, tall with a new beard." "Yardley," Abe supplied. "Mr. Yardley. They're both going on the France." He was on his way to his duties, but Abe tried to detain him. "If I didn't have to go by way of Cherbourg, the baggage went that way." "Get your baggage in New York," said Paul, receding. The logic of the suggestion fitted gradually into Abe's pitch. He grew rather enthusiastic about being cared for, or rather of the prolonging his state of irresponsibility. Other clients had meanwhile drifted into the bar. First came a huge Dane who Abe had somewhere encountered. The Dane took a seat across the room, and Abe guessed he would be there for all day, drinking, lunching, talking, or reading newspapers. He felt a desire to outstay him. At 11, the college boys began to step in, stepping gingerly lest they tear on one another bag from bag. It was about then he had the chasseur telephone to the Divers. By the time he was in touch with them, he was in touch also with other friends, and his hunch was to put them all on different phones at once. The result was somewhat general. From time to time, his mind reverted to the fact he ought to go over and get Freeman out of jail, but he shook off all the facts as part of the nightmare. By 1 o'clock, the bar was jammed. Amidst the consequent mixture of voices, the staff of waiters functioned, pinning down their clients to the facts of drink and money. "That makes 2 stingers, and 1 more, 2 martinis, and 1... Nothing for you, Mr. Quarterly. That makes 3 rounds. That makes 75 francs, Mr. Quarterly. Mr. Schaffer said he had this. You had the last. I can only do what you say. Thanks very much." In the confusion, Abe had lost his seat. Now he stood gently swaying and talking to some of the people with whom he had involved himself. A terrier ran a leash around his legs, but Abe managed to extricate himself without upsetting and became the recipient of profuse apologies. Presently, he was invited to lunch, but declined. It was almost Brileth, he explained, and there was something he had to do at Brileth. A little later, with the exquisite manners of the alcoholic that are like the manners of a prisoner or a family servant, he said goodbye to an acquaintance and turning around discovered that the bar's greater moment was over precipitately as it had begun. Across from him, the Dane and his companions had ordered lunch. Abe did likewise, but scarcely touched it. Afterwards, he just sat, happy to live in the past. The drink made past happy things contemporary with the present, as if they were still going on, contemporary even with the future, as if it were about to happen again. At 4, the chasseur approached him. "You wish to see a fellow of the name Jules Peterson?" "God, how did he find me?" "I didn't tell him you were present." "Who did?" Abe fell over his glasses but recovered himself. "Says he's already been all around to the American bars and hotel." "Tell him I'm not here." As the chasseur turned away, Abe asked, "Can he come in here?" "I'll find out." Receiving the question, Paul glanced over his shoulder. He shook his head, then, seeing Abe, he came over. "I'm sorry, I can't allow it." Abe got himself up with an effort and went out to the Rue Cambon. Alright, that's the end of chapter 23. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time for the next chapters. Bye!